On a frozen stretch of Interstate 80 in Wyoming, the storm didn't just cover the road, it erased it. Visibility dropped to nothing, and most drivers kept going afraid to stop. But one 45-year-old veteran slowed down. In his headlights stood a pregnant German shepherd shaking exhausted and completely alone. She didn't run. She didn't bark. She just stood there, as if waiting for a decision that could mean life or death. What the man did next was not heroic in the way movies promise, but it triggered a chain of events that exposed a hidden cruelty, divided a town, and turned a quiet cabin into a place of rescue. Stay with this story until the end, because the real test had only just begun. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Snow erased Interstate 80 until the road felt like a rumor wind scraping the plains of Wyoming and pressing night into a moving wall of white. Michael Carter drove with both hands steady on the wheel, not tense, just deliberate the way men move after years of learning that panic wastes time. At 45, he carried the quiet geometry of someone shaped by discipline, rather than display broad shoulders set without flourish, a square jaw marked by a trimmed beard that grew in dark and coarse eyes, a cold, watchful gray that had learned to measure distance before emotion. He wore an old dark brown leather coat, softened by years of weather, a red and navy flannel beneath it. Faded jeans rubbed pale at the knees, insulated leather boots planted against the pedals, and a gray wool scarf wrapped once habitually as if routine itself could keep the cold at bay. The truck was older than most of the traffic he passed. On clear days, its engine reliable in a way Michael trusted, because it did not pretend to be anything else. He was headed back to a wooden cabin perched alone on a low rise, a place he had built with his hands after leaving the Navy, choosing distance not out of bitterness, but because silence had become the only language that did not argue with his memories. The storm did not frighten him. Storms were facts, and facts could be respected without being feared. What unsettled him was how the world narrowed under weather like this, how everything became immediate, how the past found ways to speak when the present offered fewer distractions. He slowed without pride, wipers fighting for relevance, headlights carving a thin tunnel that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. That was when the light caught something low and wrong near the shoulder, a shape that did not belong to driftwood or deer. Michael eased off the gas, letting the truck settle instead of braking hard the tires, whispering a warning over black ice, and as the shape shifted again, life resolved out of the white. A German shepherd stood there, female, her build strong but depleted winter-thick coat, black and tan, now matted with snow and grit, as if the storm had tried to braid her into the land. Her belly hung heavy with pregnancy, ribs hinted beneath fur, where food had been rationed by circumstance or neglect, legs trembling with fatigue that had nothing to do with cold alone. One ear carried a small old nick clean and healed the kind of scar that spoke of defense rather than accident. Her eyes were amber brown and clear, not pleading, not wild present. She did not bark. She did not run. She simply stood in the cone of light, a living line between what had been endured and what might still be possible. Michael brought the truck to a controlled stop and put it in park, engine idling like a held breath. He stayed where he was for a moment, watching, because the first seconds after discovery were often the truest. The dog's nostrils flared, paws shifting once to brace. It was not aggression. It was calculation. He reached for the latch of his coat, shrugged out of the leather, and the cold bit immediately sharp and instructive. He placed the coat on the snow between them, not as bait, but as signal, then took a step back, hands open, posture low, the same shape he had used with frightened civilians and frightened animals alike. The wind rose a long, angry sound that pushed at his balance and filled his lashes with ice. The dog's gaze tracked him with intelligence rather than panic. He could see the faint, flattened ring in the fur at her neck, where a collar might once have pressed too long, too hard, and the split ends of her nails raw crescents that spoke of miles over frozen ground. A contraction rippled through her flank, visible even in the storm light, and for an instant the world tilted toward memory's sterile rooms, machines breathing a hand warm and already leaving. But Michael did not move. He let the feeling exist without letting it command him, because he had learned the cost of reacting to ghosts. The dog took one step forward, then another pause testing the coat, as if asking whether it would betray her. She paused ears forward, then looked past Michael into the white emptiness behind him, as if expecting danger to arrive from places that looked like nothing until it was too late. He nodded once, acknowledging her terms, and stayed still. Time stretched into that strange place where trust is forged not by words, but by the absence of wrong moves. Then, far down the interstate, another light flared and vanished, a brief pulse swallowed by snow. Michael felt it before he named it, the awareness that choices were narrowing, that the storm did not care who was right, only who remained. He turned his head just enough to mark the distance, then returned his attention to the dog, because whatever approached mattered less than what stood in front of him now. The wind howled harder, snow stinging his face, and the coat lay dark against the white like a boundary drawn by hand. He held his ground, the road erased around them, the past pressing at the edges, the future arriving as a flicker in the storm, and the dog stood there with him, heavy with life, refusing to vanish. Morning came slowly to the hills of Wyoming, pale light leaking through low clouds and settling over the snow-bound valley like a held breath. The storm had passed, but it left behind a world stripped bare quiet, in a way that felt deliberate rather than peaceful. Michael Carter guided the truck up the narrow track toward his cabin tires, crunching softly over packed snow, the engine's low rumble the only sound that argued with the cold. The cabin stood where it always had alone on the rise, its dark timber walls scarred by years of wind and winter. Michael had built it himself after leaving the Navy, choosing rough-hewn logs and a low roofline that hugged the land, as if asking the mountain for permission to stay. He parked, cut the engine, and for a moment simply sat there, listening. Inside the cab, the German Shepherd lay curled on the back seat, her sides rising and falling in shallow but steady rhythm. Up close in the forgiving gray of morning, she looked older than he had first guessed, perhaps 5 or 6, her strength worn thin by time and circumstance, rather than age alone. Her coat, once thick and glossy, was dulled by grime and salt, and the heavy swell of her belly made every movement a calculation. Michael opened the door, and the cold rushed in sharp and honest. He moved carefully, sliding an arm beneath her chest and another beneath her hindquarters, lifting just enough to guide rather than carry. She allowed it body-stiff but compliant eyes, tracking him with a calm that felt earned rather than naive. Inside the cabin, warmth waited in layers, the steady heat of the stove, the faint smell of wood smoke embedded in the walls, the quiet that had once been empty and now felt attentive. He laid her on a folded blanket near the hearth, not too close to the fire, remembering instincts learned in other emergencies, that heat, like force, could harm when rushed. She turned, once then settled, arranging herself to protect the space beneath her belly, as if the future already had weight. Michael watched hands, still heart, doing things he did not yet have names for. He gave her water first, holding the bowl low and steady. She drank cautiously, pausing between swallows, eyes never leaving him, as if measuring how much of the world she could afford to trust. When she finished, she licked the rim once and rested her chin on the blanket, eyes half-lidded, but alert. Michael stood and moved through the cabin with practiced restraint, adjusting the thermostat, hanging his damp scarf to dry, placing his old leather coat over a chair where it could remember the night. He did not speak. He had learned that words could clutter moments that needed space. It was only when he sat on the floor a few feet away, back against the wall, that he realized the cabin sounded different. There was another breath in it now, another rhythm that did not belong to the wind or the stove. The realization unsettled him more than the storm had. He thought of his wife, of the way rooms had gone quiet after she died, how silence had become a shape he could predict and endure. This was different. This was presence. He named her Bella without ceremony. The word came easily common and unadorned, the kind of name people gave to dogs they expected to live ordinary lives. Saying it once softly felt like placing a marker in the room, a claim not of ownership but of recognition. Bella did not lift her head, but her ear twitched, a small acknowledgement that the sound had reached her. By mid-morning, the sky had thinned to a dull blue, and Michael heard the crunch of tires on the drive. He stood, tension settling into his shoulders out of habit, then eased as he recognized the vehicle, an aging Subaru wagon dusted with road salt. Sarah Mitchell stepped out, pulling her parka tighter against the cold. She was 38, average height, lean in the way of someone who moved more than she sat, with auburn hair pulled back into a practical low ponytail that left wisps free around her temples. Her skin was pale from winter, and long hours indoors, freckles scattered across her nose, and her eyes, a clear hazel, held the steady focus of someone accustomed to making decisions that mattered. Sarah had grown up in the town down the mountain, returned after veterinary school, and carried herself with a quiet competence that did not ask to be admired. Loss had shaped her too, though differently. Years earlier she had lost a brother to a farm accident, and since then she had treated fragile things with a particular patience, as if every life deserved to be handled twice as carefully. Inside the cabin, she knelt without hesitation, movements, economical voice low. She let Bella smell her first gloved hands resting on her knees, posture open. Bella watched, ears forward, body tense, but not defensive. Sarah's touch when it came was deliberate, and respectful, fingers tracing along ribs, pausing at the faint indentation around Bella's neck, where fur lay flattened and pale. She checked gums, eyes, hydration, listening to the cadence of Bella's breathing. "She's dehydrated," Sarah said quietly, more to the room than to Michael. "Underweight for this stage. Whatever she's been through, it wasn't brief." Michael nodded, jaw set, something hard settling behind his ribs. Sarah's brow tightened as she felt the swell of Bella's abdomen, counting, assessing. "She's close. A few days at most. Stress could push it sooner." She glanced up at Michael, meeting his eyes. "You did right bringing her in and not forcing heat. Keep it steady. Quiet. She needs rest more than anything." Michael listened the way he had listened to briefings long ago, absorbing without interruption. He asked only what mattered, how much water, how often, what signs to watch for. Sarah answered plainly, appreciating the discipline beneath his stillness. Before she left, she straightened and gave him a look that carried both warning and trust. "If anything changes, you call me. Day or night." He thanked her, the words sounding heavier than they should have, as if gratitude itself had weight. After she was gone, the cabin settled again, but it did not return to its old silence. Michael moved through the hours with a new attention, offering water in small amounts, keeping the temperature even, sitting nearby without crowding. Bella slept, truly slept, her body loosening by degrees. Each time she shifted, Michael felt the pull of memory, the instinct to hover, to control. And each time he resisted it, choosing instead to be present without intrusion. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and the world resumed its slow winter business. Inside the cabin held two lives that had not planned to intersect, learning the shape of each other's quiet. Night returned quietly to the Wyoming hills, the kind of winter night that did not announce itself, but simply settled in, pressing cold against the cabin walls and laying a thin, patient hush over the land. Inside, firelight breathed in slow pulses, shadows rising and falling along the timber, as if the room itself were alive and listening. Michael Carter sat on the wooden floor with his back against the wall, knees drawn slightly up, boots still on out of habit rather than need. His dark brown leather coat hung from a peg near the stove, drying stiffly, while his gray wool scarf remained looped around his neck, a small armor he had forgotten to remove. He did not feel uncomfortable. Discomfort was familiar territory. What unsettled him was the waiting. Bella lay on the blankets near the hearth, her large frame arranged carefully, every movement measured. In the dim light, her German shepherd features looked both powerful and worn, her black and tan coat catching embers of gold where it was clean and sinking into shadow where snowmelt still darkened the fur. Her breathing had changed sometime after dusk, shifting from deep and steady to patterned and deliberate, as if her body were counting down to something it already understood. Michael noticed the change without panic. He had learned long ago that panic narrowed vision, and tonight he needed to see everything. He stayed where he was, hands open on his knees, listening, not just with his ears, but with the part of himself that had learned to read small signals under pressure. The tightening along Bella's flank, the way her tail stiffened and then relaxed, the faint tremor that ran through her legs and passed. A contraction came unmistakable, rippling through her body like a wave traveling beneath the surface of water. Bella did not cry out. She lifted her head, amber eyes bright in the firelight, and for a moment her gaze met Michael's. There was no fear in it, only focus, and something else he recognized with a jolt of familiarity, resolve. He did not move toward her. He remembered Sarah Mitchell's voice from earlier that day, calm and exact, reminding him that intervention was not the same as help. Presence mattered. Quiet mattered. So he stayed where he was, grounding himself in the rhythm of his own breath, letting the room hold the rest. Time loosened its grip. Outside, the wind brushed the eaves and moved on snow, whispering across the roof, like a question already answered. Inside the fire popped softly a sound that felt almost intrusive in the concentration that filled the space. Another contraction took Bella longer this time, her body curved inward muscles working with an ancient efficiency that did not need instruction. Michael felt memory press at the edges of his mind, bright hospital lights, the mechanical hush of machines, the way waiting could become its own kind of torment, but he did not push it away. He let it exist without letting it steer him. That was new. That was different. When the first puppy arrived, it did so with suddenness, a small, dark shape emerging into the world, slick with effort and possibility. For a heartbeat, it lay still impossibly tiny against the blankets, its body barely larger than Michael's hand. The room narrowed to a single point. Michael leaned forward slightly, instinct urging him to act, to fix, to do something that would feel like control. He stopped himself. Bella was already there, turning with focused tenderness, her tongue moving with practiced precision. Seconds stretched thin and sharp. Then the puppy twitched a faint flutter beneath the ribs, followed by a fragile gasp that sounded more imagined than real. Michael exhaled slowly, carefully, as if his breath might set the pace for the room. Life answered. The puppy found warmth, pressing blindly against Bella's belly, a dark comma in a sentence still being written. Michael felt pressure behind his eyes and did not look away. He had waited for breath before. He had counted seconds like prayers. This time the counting ended differently. Bella barely paused before the next contraction came, her work relentless, uncomplaining. The second puppy arrived faster, sliding into the firelight with an indignant twitch, one ear folded awkwardly, the other struggling to decide whether it would ever stand. The sight would have been funny on any other night, and despite himself, Michael felt his mouth lift in a brief, incredulous smile. Humor, he realized, did not break the gravity of the moment. It made room for it. The third puppy followed not long after, smaller than the others, its face darker, a faint mask forming around the eyes, as if it had been born already carrying a secret. It squeaked once, a thin, insistent sound, and rooted forward with a determination that felt almost defiant. Bella nosed each of them in turn, counting without numbers, making sure the world had kept its promises. When she was satisfied, she lowered herself onto her side flanks, heaving eyes, never leaving the three small bodies pressed against her warmth. She had done her work. She remained vigilant. Michael shifted closer now, still careful, still respecting the invisible boundary Bella had drawn, and allowed him to approach. He checked what needed checking, without fuss, adjusting a blanket here, moving a towel there, so no single puppy took the full reach of the stove's heat. His hands were steady movements, economical, the same hands that had once handled far different stakes with far louder consequences. Tonight the work felt heavier and lighter at the same time. He warmed a small bottle as Sarah had shown him earlier, testing it against the inside of his wrist, where skin remembered extremes. When he offered it, Bella watched with a stern maternal calculus, then allowed him close enough to help the smallest mouth latch. The sound that followed was more insistence than hunger, a tiny engine catching in the dark. Something in Michael's chest expanded in response, unfamiliar and welcome. As the night deepened, the storm outside lost its edge, wind easing into long exhalations that moved through the trees and past. The cabin held a different music, now fire breath, and three fragile rhythms weaving themselves into the quiet. Michael sat back against the wall again, boots planted back straight, letting his presence be what it was. He thought of loss, of the shape it had carved in him, and of the truth he had resisted for years, that loss did not vanish, but it could be carried without closing the hand completely. Responsibility, he realized, was not a burden imposed from outside. Sometimes it arrived gently wrapped in breath and warmth, asking only that you stay. When Bella finally slept, truly slept, her body curved protectively around the puppies, Michael remained where he was, eyes open, listening. The cabin was no longer silent. It was alive with something fragile and stubborn and real. He did not name the feeling that settled over him then. He did not need to. The night continued, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel alone inside it. The morning broke cold and bright over the Wyoming Valley sunlight, sharpening the edges of snowbanks and turning the road into a pale ribbon that led Michael Carter down toward town. He drove with the same deliberate calm that had carried him through storms and nights without sleep. The old truck humming beneath him, his dark brown leather coat creasing at the elbows as he shifted gears. He needed supplies, milk replacer, clean towels. Fuel, ordinary items that felt newly consequential, now that the cabin held more than memories. Town sat low and spread out along the highway, a handful of buildings pressed together against the weather, the feed store a diner with fogged windows, a hardware shop that smelled of oil and wood. Michael parked and stepped out, boots crunching gray scarf tucked high against his jaw eyes, scanning without hurry. He had learned to notice exits and faces without advertising the habit. Inside the feed store, warmth and dust wrapped around him, and he moved the aisles with quiet efficiency, exchanging nods with people who knew him by sight, if not by story. He was loading his purchases onto the counter when a voice slid into the space beside him, confident without warmth. "You've got my dog." Michael turned and took in David Collins at once, 46 average height, a body that had once been strong and had since softened into neglect, shoulders rounded as if posture were optional. David's hair was thinning, brown-combed straight back with effort, his beard patchy and untrimmed, framing a mouth that smiled without reaching the eyes. Those eyes were pale hazel, quick, and appraising, practiced at reading rooms and people for leverage. His coat was clean and too light for the cold collar turned up as posture rather than protection. He smelled faintly of cologne layered over something sharp and metallic. "I helped a dog in a storm," Michael said evenly, not pretending surprise, not rising to the bait. David's smile thinned. "She's a German shepherd?" "Pregnant," answered to Bella once he said the name used like proof. "Property's property. I've got papers." He spoke of ownership the way some men spoke of tools, not cruelty, not care. He mentioned money as a lubricant, suggested reimbursement for inconvenience, offered civility that felt rehearsed. Michael listened, jaw set, feeling the familiar chill of recognition. He had met men like this in other contexts, men who hid predation behind procedure. He paid for his items, took the receipt, and said quietly, "If you're claiming ownership, go through the proper channels." David's eyes flicked to the door, then back. "I prefer things easy," he replied, the word easy, doing heavy work. Outside, the light felt too clean for the exchange that had just occurred. Michael stood for a beat, letting the encounter settle into his bones. He did not feel fear. He felt clarity. He turned not toward the road home, but toward the low brick building at the edge of town, the one with the county seal on the door. Sheriff Robert Hayes was 52 tall, in a way that came from long limbs, rather than show his face cut into planes by wind and years of refusing to pretend his job was simple. His hair was dark with gray at the temples, his beard trimmed close, his eyes winter blue and steady. He wore his uniform the way men wore work, without ornament, without apology, and he disliked cruelty more than he disliked paperwork, which made him dangerous to the wrong kind of person. Michael told him what had happened without drama, naming words and timing not impressions. Hayes listened with arms folded, then leaned back, considering. If he had documentation, the sheriff said, tasting the word, he'd have led with it. He stood already reaching for his jacket. What followed was not noise, but method. They spoke with Sarah Mitchell, who documented Bella's condition in precise language: dehydration, malnourishment, stress indicators, consistent with prolonged confinement, the flattened ring at the neck where a chain had once pressed too long. Hayes made calls, asked dates instead of opinions, looked at records that were missing where they should have existed. A neighbor mentioned trucks at odd hours and dogs that did not sound like family pets. The feed store clerk recalled bulk purchases that stopped abruptly. By afternoon, pieces arranged themselves into a pattern that did not require imagination to read. Back in town, the air shifted. Conversations paused when Michael entered rooms. Eyes followed him with curiosity and caution. Some nodded in support, recognizing care when they saw it. Others frowned and said he should not interfere, that business was business, that property had rules. Michael did not answer them. He forwarded what he heard to Hayes and returned to the work that mattered. At the cabin, Bella rested with her puppies, the dullness lifting from her coat day by day, the pale ring at her neck remaining as a quiet testament. Michael replaced towels, warmed water, measured time in small tasks that refused spectacle. Night brought a different kind of listening. An engine coughed somewhere beyond the trees and faded. Bella rose, once placing her body between Michael and the nest ear's forward eyes, fixed on the dark. He felt the meaning before he named it. She had not feared the storm. She feared a kind of person. He stood with her, not reaching for anything but presence, and when the sound passed, they remained alert together. The town continued to murmur, dividing itself along lines that had always been there. Michael accepted that. He had learned that justice did not improve when shouted. It improved when documented. He sat at the table that night and wrote down times and words the cadence of David Collins's offers the way his eyes searched for exits. He placed Sarah's notes beside the list-aligned edges clean. Outside the valley held its breath under stars sharpened by cold. Inside responsibility took on weight and shape. He did not know how long the road ahead would be, or how it would test him, only that the choice he had made in a storm was now asking to be carried forward patiently, lawfully, without shortcuts. Winter light cut the Wyoming morning into clean edges, pale sun reflecting off courthouse steps, still dusted with old snow, the air cold enough to feel intentional rather than cruel. Michael Carter stood at the entrance with his shoulders squared and his breath steady, the same dark brown leather coat resting over his red and navy flannel faded jeans creased by habit, gray scarf wrapped once around his neck, as if the day required ritual as much as warmth. He had slept little, not from fear, but from attention, the kind that keeps a man upright when outcomes are no longer abstract. Inside the building, sound softened into wood, and stone footsteps, measured voices lowered. Sheriff Robert Hayes nodded once, as Michael passed, his winter blue eyes' steady posture, unadorned a man who carried procedure like a tool, meant to protect rather than impress. Sarah Mitchell sat a few rows back, auburn hair pulled into its practical tie hands, folded loosely in her lap, freckles faint against pale winter skin. Her calm presence a reminder that facts, when treated carefully, could hold their ground. The hearing was brief, by design narrow in scope, its purpose not to resolve everything, but to decide what must not be undone. Judge Evelyn Parker presided, early 60s, tall and spare silver hair drawn into a precise bun that revealed a face shaped by patience rather than softness. Her glasses were thin, almost delicate, but her gaze did not drift. She asked questions that arrived exactly where they needed to land, surgical and fair, and when she listened, she did so without hurry. The county attorney spoke of risk and care, of timelines and conditions. Sarah testified with the same clarity she brought to her work, describing Bella's dehydration malnourishment, the flattened ring at her neck, where a chain had once pressed too long, the stress indicators that told a story bodies could not lie about. She did not editorialize. She documented. David Collins sat stiffly at the other table, coat too clean, jaw tight, beneath patchy beard, pale hazel eyes, scanning for advantage. He spoke of ownership and papers, and inconvenience, his words organized like a ledger. He did not speak of water. He did not speak of warmth. Michael did not speak at all. He had learned when to let evidence carry the weight. At the judge's request, Animal Control entered with Bella on a short lead for a brief demonstration, nothing theatrical, only necessary. Bella walked into the room with a composure that did not ask permission. Her black and tan coat thickened back toward health. Amber eyes clear. She did not pull. She did not hesitate. When guided toward David Collins, she stopped. The refusal was simple and absolute. No fear, no growl, just stillness. The room felt the decision before it was named. Judge Parker watched without interruption, then nodded once as if confirming what the evidence had already said. The ruling came without flourish. David Collins's claim of ownership was terminated. Temporary custody remained with Michael Carter, with a clear path toward adoption pending statutory steps. Contact was prohibited. Investigation would continue. The gavel did not need to strike hard. The sound was enough. Outside, the light felt different, less sharp, as if winter had eased its grip by a fraction. David Collins exited First Shoulder's tight eyes, avoiding the steps. He did not look back. Michael watched him go without triumph, feeling something closer to alignment, a quiet settling of lines that had been out of place. Sheriff Hayes clasped Michael's shoulder briefly, a gesture of work completed, but vigilance retained. Sarah offered a small smile that did not claim credit, only relief. The town gathered its breath and let it out slowly, people nodding, some smiling, some simply observing as if recalibrating a story they thought they knew. Weeks passed in the way weeks do when something important is happening beneath the surface. The paperwork moved. The checks were made. Bella healed into her strength, the dullness lifting from her coat, the pale ring at her neck remaining as a testament rather than a wound. The three puppies grew into themselves differences, sharpening into personalities that felt like arguments with gravity. One pressed forward with cheerful insistence, another followed sound like a promise, the third watched first, then entered moments with deliberate certainty. Michael learned their rhythms the way he had once learned terrain, not to dominate, but to understand. The cabin changed without announcing itself. It smelled less of smoke and more of soap. Towels stacked neatly by the stove. Bowls lined like punctuation. Silence did not disappear. It learned to share. On adoption day, the formalities were brief and precise. Judge Parker's signature sealed what the storm had begun. Michael carried the papers home, folded cleanly, placing them on the table without ceremony. He did not need to look at them to know what they said. Responsibility had already rearranged his days. He found that mornings rose with purpose, that small tasks, warming water, checking paws, replacing a loose board on the porch, held him steady. Loss did not leave. It did not have to. It sat where it always had, quieter now, no longer in command. Late winter softened into thaw. Snow loosened its grip on the road until the interstate looked less like a wound and more like a scar that had learned to close. On the hill, Michael stood on the porch as the day leaned toward evening, the old leather coat creasing at the shoulders flannel, catching the last light gray scarf lifting in a mild wind. Bella lay at his side, body relaxed, eyes attentive, the three puppies tumbling in the meltwater with clumsy joy. He watched without urgency, hands resting where they fell present, without needing to direct. The cabin behind him held warmth and proof. The road below curved away, no longer asking him to pass by. He did not think of miracles. He thought of choices made in weather, of the discipline to stop, of the courage to stay. The world did not applaud. It did not need to. The day went on, and that was enough. Sometimes the miracle is not that the storm ends, but that someone chooses to stop while it is still raging. In a world that moves fast and rewards indifference, grace often arrives quietly, through patience, restraint, and the courage to care when no one is watching. This story reminds us that God does not always work through thunder or spectacle. Often he works through ordinary people who listen, who stay, who offer warmth instead of turning away. In our daily lives, we may never face a blizzard on an empty highway, but we all encounter moments where compassion asks us to slow down and choose responsibility over convenience. When we do, even our deepest losses can become places where new purpose grows. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what moment stayed with you the longest, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, courage, and quiet miracles. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and guide your steps with light and peace.